This time last year there was a sense, a year on from that Uluru Statement in the Heart, 2017, that change was coming. Much of that hinged on the expectations of a federal Labor government, Labor having pledged to back the voice where the coalition had not. A returned Morrison Government has committed to working towards a consensus position, but it's unclear what that means. Before we go to that, some facts about where the statement and its voice came from. Stephanie Bolchi reports.
It was a truly consultative process of Indigenous Australians. A bipartisan appointed referendum council was set up to advise how First Australians could be best recognised in the Constitution.
Many of you have been on the journey of constitutional recognition for a very long time.
We are working today to right a great wrong.
From city to bush, Hobart, Broome, Sydney and Cairns, 13 regional dialogues heard from 1,200 people between December 2016 to May 2017. From there, those who attended the dialogues went back to their own communities to further consult at a local level. From the regional dialogue consultation, the Referendum Council proposed 5 options, leading to Uluru, where 250 delegates from across the southern sky met.
We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people.
And an historic consensus was reached, spelled out in this one-page document called the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice.
A First Nations voice to Parliament to be enshrined in the Constitution was the centrepiece.
Vote yes for Aborigines.
The most successful referendum directly impacting Indigenous Australians was back in 1967, when more than 90% of the country voted yes to alter the 1901 Constitution.
The time has come when Australia can no longer tolerate legal racial discrimination.
Those changes allowed Indigenous Australians to be counted in the population and also gave the Commonwealth power to make laws about Indigenous Australians.
The treaty enabled by Constitution.
50 years on, Indigenous Australians called for a say in laws that would impact them. The Voice's role would be to advise during the construction of legislation and policy. It would not have the power to make or change laws.
The idea of the Voice is to inform, not to dictate. So the idea was to make sure that members of Parliament are well informed in relation to the wishes of Aboriginal people, the needs of Aboriginal people, the impact a law will have on Aboriginal people.
It was inaccurately described as a third chamber by the then Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce.
Another chamber in politics, or another something that sort of sits beside or above the Senate. That idea just won't fly.
Echoed by other MPs and our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
People can dress it up any way they like, but I think 2 chambers is enough.
Nationals Barnaby Joyce stopped short of taking back his comments.
Well, if I got it wrong and you're saying that I did and they're saying I did, I apologise unreservedly. And we're going to take the debate forward in a form that succeeds.
Ken Wyatt has committed to working towards a consensus opinion for a referendum for Indigenous recognition, but he isn't promising it.
I don't want to proceed if we don't have the right question.
I'm not sure that a consensus is possible to do the right thing by as many people as possible.
The Voice is yet to be designed. Ken Wyatt hasn't ruled out legislating it.
It is possible and likely that there will be a legislative structure as we work through the code design process. But there is also a call for a set of words within the Constitution. Now, I want to be cautious with the words that we put into the Constitution.
Another aspect of the Uluru Statement from the Heart was a makarata, taken from the Yolngu language on the land we're on today.
Makarata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle.
More recently used to describe a treaty. A Makarata Commission, separate to the enshrined Voice, would supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nations, as well as truth-telling about history.
Former High Court Judge Kirby said, look, this is what an Indigenous voice isn't. It isn't a specialised Indigenous seats in Parliament, like they have in New Zealand. It's not proportional representation for Indigenous Australians. It's not a veto on legislation. And it's not a guarantee that Aboriginal people will always be listened to. What is it?
Well, I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't. The framework shouldn't be set out by people who are not Indigenous. You know, I think that everybody here on the panel is making the point that we are articulate. You know, we know where we're come from, we know where we're going, and I think the time is to start quoting us and to start listening to us and to start letting us, you know, map the pathways to the future, and also understanding that we're not homogenous peoples and that we come from many nations, and that there's not a blueprint that fits all of us. So you can't just say just because there's 3 or 4 Indigenous people, you know, who are in Parliament, that means that, you know, that's enough. I think it's, you know, going to take a process of listening and learning and accepting that the answers don't come from non-Indigenous Australia.
But the voice has to be representative in some way, as ATSEC was, of all the many voices of Indigenous Australians.
Yes. It's got to be an elected body, decided by Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people, and you know, and it's got to work within the machinery of government.
But give us the chance to map that process.
It'll be the elected representatives' decisions on, you know, how they do it and so on. So they represent a constituency, so they would know what their constituency's expectations are. And I think that the other thing that needs to happen is that governments need to radically rethink the way they work with our people. So the days of bureaucrats going in and saying, have we got a program for you, and here's $5 instead of, you know, 500, are over. Our people have to be at the negotiating table at every level in this country, where we say to the government representatives, these are the needs in our community, these are the priorities, this is the order we want those dealt with, this is how much it's going to cost, we want you to deliver.
But Djawa, can I ask you, why do you all need a voice? I mean, you're a sovereign people, you're in control of this land, you get royalties, you run a mine, why do you need a voice?
Well, it's not for our own people. We need a voice in there for the whole of the First Nations people of Australia. And like I mentioned earlier, now is the time to go about talking to the new minister. I met with him this morning, and my message was, let's sharpen our spears, polish our woomeras, our digging sticks, to beat that voice. But we use those spears and woomeras and digging sticks for a good cause, to be able to put that voice in Parliament for the whole of Indigenous Australians or the First Nations people.
So you were urging him to fight?
Yes, for us. As a Yolngu representative from the Noongar tribe, Western Australia. That's where he comes from.
What did he say?
He said, we'll talk about it. I'll take it back to my leader and I'll talk about it. Because my brother met with him, myself and a couple of others. We pulled him outside this morning.
And did you talk to him about the importance of enshrining it in the Constitution?
Yes, and that's when we said, enough is enough. Gotta be real.
That was your message to this government?
That was our message to his government.
Because you have to remember that it's in the lived lifetimes of Djawa and, you know, everybody in our immediate family, you know, who came before us, you know, later on, that 67 referendum, but it wasn't until 71, you know. That's kind of in the lived experience of, you know, being recognised, you know, in the Constitution. So let's move on from that. Have we actually come very far? And let's make the steps to do that.
And adding on to that, this group, us, who are here, our elders fought for the land rights. And Gumatj and the Riddiching, the two main parties of whose land here belongs to. And we had other groups that backed us up all the way to the High Court. And hence, the birthright of the land rights was born here. And that's where the land rights came from.
And so how do you feel when the Prime Minister says, well, look, no, we're not going to put it in the Constitution? Do you lose hope, or do you just think, no, we got to press on?
And then I'd call him, he's not the right man to lead Australia, especially when he rejects young people.
We have to press on. We don't have any choice.
Well, we're waiting for another Prime Minister. We're good at waiting for Prime Ministers to make up their minds. And I mean, you mentioned Uluru sovereignty earlier. That might be in name, but in terms of sharing power, it's not true. The territory government or the federal government can knock over anything the Uluru want to do.
Right.
So the issue here, and particularly with respect to treaties, is how do we share that power? How do we share that power? And the Northern Territory government has said, with respect to my job, that they accept that the Aboriginal First Nations in the Northern Territory govern themselves under their own laws and customs for thousands of years, that they were sovereigns, they hadn't ceded that sovereignty. That's where we should be talking about influencing what government does, so that we, as sovereign peoples who haven't ceded our power, share some of that power. We're not saying we want to take over your power, we want to share your power. Then we don't need them. If we're sharing that power, why do we need a voice? Because we deal with them as government to government.
In a treaty framework?
In a treaty framework, yes.
You know, Thomas, when the Referendum Council was doing its work, it did some surveys of non-Indigenous people who said they had a concern that voice represented some sort of special treatment for Indigenous people. And there's a view that 1967 was carried because it represented equality, giving Indigenous people what every Australian has a right to. But somehow this is not equality but difference.
Yeah, well, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are a special people to this nation. You know, we've been connected to it for more than 65,000 years. We have the worst statistics that are a crying shame in this world, you know, the most incarcerated people on the planet. I mean, absolutely we are special and we deserve a rightful place in this country. And what happened in 1901, with the expectation that our people would die out, is that we were excluded. And, you know, ex-Chief Justice Gleeson really made it clear that we have never been equal in this country since that exclusion. And this is something that can be done.
Pat, I mean, you're dedicated to closing the gap. I mean, that's your life's work in health. What do you say to that idea that it's much harder to achieve constitutional change in this country if you're arguing for difference instead of equality, when it's framed like that?
For people to say that we've had equality is wrong, because the resources have never, ever been provided to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to ensure that equality, neither by local governments and the way that they work with our communities. State governments have a lot to answer for in terms of the service delivery and their level of investment, and the Commonwealth itself. So
it's already different. I mean, Indigenous people already have a different experience of life in Australia.
It's a negative experience compared to most Australians.
Right.
Where we've still got communities that don't have proper, healthy, potable water supplies, have decent housing. We want housing for health. We don't want overcrowding. We want the things. When I became CEO of NACCHO in 1994, the housing backlog in our communities around Australia was $1.4 billion in 1994. It has never been enough resources, ever, by any government. And I've worked in government for a long time, and I know what that means. So, we go with our begging bowl every year and we get the crumbs off the table and we're expected to be grateful. Go ahead, Mick.
Sorry, Pat.
No, not at all.
What's also Australians have to understand is that our Constitution treats us in a discriminatory fashion. And the subsection 26 of section 51, which the Commonwealth has used to discriminate against people on the basis of their race, has only ever been used against Aboriginal people.
The race, right.
And 3 times in the Northern Territory with 2 Royal Commissions and the intervention. where they suspend the racial, they don't do it to anybody else on the basis of race. They've only ever done it to us. So people who say, well, you know, you're treated equally, are talking nonsense. Our constitution is racist, and we're going to fix that somehow.
What do you say to that, Djawa, that idea that you sometimes hear Australians as they struggle to understand what the voice is? Do Indigenous people want special treatment, they ask?
I think we want a fair
Well, I personally, you know, want to say to anyone who ever comes out here, come and learn our constitution and see, see for yourselves what ours looks like, and understand it better, because our constitution is not so hard, eh?
Yep.
See, it's.
And how would you describe it?
Well, we've always lived by it since time began. Australian constitution is just 200 years old. Ours is since time began.
Time immemorial.
Yeah, that's right. And when in my speech last year, I said something like, look, let the two constitutions meet together.
Right.
Yeah. Let it work together. If ever there was a voice in the parliament of the Aboriginal leaders that we now have, to be able to talk for the first Australians in parliament.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mayatili, the other thing we were talking about before we came on air was questions are sometimes asked about how representative that exhaustive, Pat's rolling her eyes, constitutional process was. So there were 12 meetings around the country, 1,200 people, Indigenous people coming together, investing their hopes. And as Thomas and I were talking about before, I mean, imagine somebody saying to you, look, I need you to give me 3 days to talk about constitutional reform. We're going to brief you on it. Well, you're pretty civic-minded. But, Ken Wyatt sometimes wonders about the lack of connection between city-based Indigenous organisation and the people they represent. So you live in Melbourne, you grew up here. Are you Indigenous elite or are you a Yolngu woman?
Well, I'm a Yolngu woman, I don't think it matters, whereabouts in the world I, choose to spend time. And I think even just, that concept is just, it's ridiculous, isn't it? It's like, I don't choose to be a Yolngu woman on Tuesdays and Thursdays and, be something else the other days of the week. It's regardless of where you are, you don't shed your indigeneity. It's with you constantly. We are who we are because of the footsteps that our ancestors have walked before us. So I think that, of course there's representation and of course, Indigenous people move around. Sometimes it doesn't kind of matter where you are.
We move around a lot.
True. Exactly.
We move around a lot.
Yes.
Look, my uncle Charles Perkins was a great activist in the 70s, the 60s. He started fighting for equal rights and, the specific Indigenous specific rights like land rights and whatever. We stand on the shoulders of great leaders who have come, for centuries before us, and we still, do our best to articulate the very needs of our people so that they can live a decent quality of life in our own country. So what I do in relation to the coalition of Aboriginal peak organisations negotiating with COAG on Close the Gap is complementary to the work that Thomas and Megan and Noel and whatever do on The Voice, is complementary to the work that Mick, Jill Gallagher and Jackie Huggins and Michael Lavache will do on the treaty processes in...
And you don't see those matters as symbolic matters?
They're not
and
symbolic.
What you're doing in health as practical? You don't see that as two different things?
No, I don't. It's all part of the spectrum of us being able to take our rightful place in our own country and being given the resources to be a really self-determining people. That's all we want.
Thomas,
it's been a policy since 71.
Thomas, is the Voice a radical, constitutionally radical proposal?
No, it's not actually. It's quite conservative. I mean,
it's a very modest ask.
It is a very modest ask in that all we're seeking to do is have a permanent representative body that cannot be dismissed as easily as John Howard did to ATSIC. I mean, it's quite a simple thing as well. The first thing you do in organising for a collective of people is organise your representation that are accountable to their own people, that are resourced and able to come together and have proper dialogue, and then set a consensus position that is never everything that everybody wants, but then be able to affect what you need to achieve for your people. There's no better way to close the gap, to address these awful statistics, than to firstly set up a representative body where we can come together and have our say.